What's up, guys? How many of you are excited for Doomsday? And how many of you have started rewatching every film and every show to catch up by December? I've already started my binge, and it's taken me back to the X-Men films. Let me tell you, I was crazy about them growing up, so you can imagine my excitement for the X-Men Reboot. And of course, this reboot is going to belong within the proper Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now that's something. Today, we're here to break down all the details about the reboot, including all the chaos, and of course, all the rumors that are floating around, so let's get into it. The X-Men franchise and the controversy behind the scenes. The first ever X-Men film in the year 2000, directed by Bryan Singer, was released before the MCU became the multi-billion-dollar franchise it is today. To put it into perspective, Iron Man was released in 2008, so X-Men basically predated all this superhero hype and was one of the major influences that kickstarted the superhero renaissance. It introduced us to a world where humans and mutants live together, but don't really coexist. A world that was full of hate, prejudice, and discrimination, and an entire population of mutants lived in fear of how they would be perceived by others and how they would be misunderstood and thought of as dangerous. Of course, the film was a commentary on otherness and discrimination, like most X-Men stories, especially considering Magneto's background in Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. But it also felt very relatable to many of us, whether you were on the spectrum, identified as queer, were struggling with your own issues, or just simply didn't fit the norm of society. The X-Men provided that representation with a shit ton of leather costumes and style, from Sir Patrick Stewart and Sir Ian McKellen playing Xavier and Magneto, Hugh Jackman and Halle Berry playing Wolverine and Storm. And we gotta say, Halle Berry clearly made better choices before the 2004 Catwoman debacle. Eventually, having grossed $300 million worldwide, this film grew into a franchise of 13 films in total and grossed over $6 billion worldwide. But things did get insanely messy behind the scenes, and trust us, it's some very questionable choices that'll make you think, what the hell was this guy smoking? Bryan Singer legit banned comics on set. Yup. The movies that were literally based on comics weren't allowed to use comics. Worse yet, he proudly never read them himself either. Weird flex, Bryan. And this wasn't even Singer's only controversy. Turns out, he made the set a living hell for everyone involved and had multiple run-ins with the cast, particularly Halle Berry. She openly discussed how they had fights during production and said, "I would sometimes be very angry with him. I got into a few fights with him and said a few curse words out of sheer frustration. When I work, I'm serious about that, and when that gets compromised, I get a little nutty." Then, there was the casting drama with Singer having to recast the role of Wolverine at the last minute. You see, he originally cast Doug Ray Scott, but Scott had scheduling conflicts with Mission Impossible 2, and so Jackman was brought in to replace him. But even with all of this chaos, there was something much darker looming over Singer's head. He had already been accused of sexual misconduct, abuse, and even raping minors on several independent and separate accounts. When asked about this, Hugh Jackman mentioned how that's a really complicated question, and though he doesn't know how to elegantly answer that, he does look back with pride at what they achieved. So now you really understand how chaotic and controversial the X-Men legacy truly is. The $71 billion deal that brought the X-Men home. I'm sure you already know how much the MCU has struggled with the rights to so many of its assets, including Spider-Man, of course the X-Men. Let's take a page out of Days of Future Past and travel back to the year 1993. Back then, Marvel was struggling financially, like they were barely afloat. So they did what they had to do to survive and sold the film rights to the X-Men to 20th Century Fox. And hey, we can't blame them. They could never have predicted the superhero boom that would happen in the near future. I mean, they would need some kind of superpower for that, right guys? But that deal pretty much locked away the X-Men from the MCU for a solid 30 years or so. And then, back in 2017, Fox finally opened the door to Disney reacquiring its assets. After around 2 years of bidding battles, Disney succeeded in getting back the rights to the X-Men and Deadpool, a whopping $71 billion deal, and any X-Men films that Fox had in development pretty much seized immediately. In fact, Deadpool and Wolverine, which was the first official MCU venture with these characters, was actually a Fox film, which was supposed to be the third Deadpool film that they'd just repurposed and probably made it better. Fans did expect that since they had the mutants, they'd drop them like they're hot, but they didn't. Feige waited patiently, and he already had the future planned out. He said, "On the road to Secret Wars, we already know very well what the story will be up until then and beyond. The X-Men are an important part of that future." so it could very well be possible that they're saving the X-Men for Phase 7, which will only begin post-December 2027. Once Secret Wars is released, Phase 6 comes to an end. We've already seen a bunch of X-Men Easter eggs, plus Professor X and Beast have already appeared on the big screen in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness and the Marvels. Kevin Feige is still keeping his plans for the mutants under wraps as of now. Feige's mandate and what hard reboot really means. So what exactly is Marvel doing with the X-Men now? Well, Kevin Feige has mentioned that the X-Men comics have been a place to tell stories about young people who feel different and who feel other, who feel like they don't belong, and that's the universal story of mutants, and that's where we're going. So it sounds like the reboot will be youth-focused, and that will reflect in the casting, tone, and perspective of the film. It'll also be a hard reboot. That means they're not going down the same road as what Fox did with First Class. Instead, they're hitting the reset button hard, with a completely new cast, new character foundations, and new arcs, as well as completely new storylines. We're reimagining the X-Men from the very beginning, basically. Thunderbolt's director, Jake Schreier, has been confirmed as the director for the project. He commented that this reboot will be recognizably different from what came before, and that they're going to try and explore all of the ideas that are inherent to that rich source material, but also the scale inherent to the source material. He's also going to be giving us a new take on all the characters, aiming to do something that feels like a fresh start. He described them as wrestling with their identity and place in the world. That's inherently interesting and complex material. The core idea of what X-Men is involves complexity, and actually, we really like this whole reboot idea. It seems like the MCU has been struggling to usher in their next era, and we think this might really help, especially since they're giving a well-deserved and needed send-off to the OG X-Men in Avengers Doomsday, including Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen, James Marsden, Kelsey Grammer, Alan Cumming, and Rebecca Romaine. And once that's done, the transition will be complete for the MCU to then take over and reboot and rewind. Of course, Feige is and will be heavily involved throughout the entire reboot process, considering that he was an associate producer on the OG X-Men film and has watched the entire Bryan Singer phase and has produced almost every MCU film and series ever. So at least we have that implicit guarantee, you know? Although, we gotta admit, we do kinda trust Jake Schreier at this point. Jake Schreier, the director, the writers, and the source material. So you probably watched Thunderbolts, which has a pretty impressive 93% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, right? Well, that was directed by the same guy, Jake Schreier, who was announced as the director of the X-Men reboot by Kevin Feige himself. Also, we really enjoyed his work on the series Beef, although you might know him from Paper Towns. All this to say that he does action almost as well as he does dark comedy and genuine characters. And his work on Thunderbolts, he's learned how to manage an ensemble cast that's pretty typical of a Marvel movie nowadays. He says, "The biggest learning curve for me was the proportion of the action to the more emotional character-driven scenes, and how, even though it's more shooting days than I've ever had, they get eaten up quite quickly by the action stuff. By the time we got to the end of it, it felt like, oh, now I feel like we get how to do this a little better." He also mentioned really enjoying the epic set pieces that the MCU is famous for. He said, "We're in the middle of nowhere in Utah, in a gorgeous location, owning a road and filming in 100-degree heat, or finding yourself on the second tallest building in the world. These are very special experiences." This is definitely a good sign because we're sure there will be many such sequences in the X-Men reboot as well. Plus, he's backed up by Kevin Feige, apparently was really supportive during Thunderbolts. Feige told him, "People talk about the Marvel look. I don't know what the Marvel look is, I just want good movies made." And that really encouraged Schreier to go for something different. In fact, Feige pushed for something different, and Schreier was just to the challenge. With the X-Men reboot, Schreier also has the insanely talented writing duo of Lee Sung-jin, the creator of Beef, and Joanna Callow from The Bear. That doesn't really sound like your typical superhero movie team, right? I actually think that's great. It'll give a fresh perspective, maybe avoid some of the repetitive tropes and visions. This could be really genuinely great for the movie, you know? Schreier's logic behind assembling this team was that he really liked their ability to take small interpersonal dynamics and explode them onto a much larger canvas. He says, when you go back and read X-Men comics, there's ideology, but also interpersonal drama, almost of a soap opera quality. If we have writers who understand both, how to drive ideology from personal stakes, if we get that right, that's what will feel most honest to what X-Men can be. And finally, the three of them also have some very solid source material on law. Apparently, they've already started sitting in and drafting stuff up together, and one of the more important phases that they're drawing from is Chris Claremont's era with the X-Men. Here's what Schreier had to say about that. I also think that just having the time to kind of sit back, and I've been digging into so many of the old comics and the entire Claremont run, just going through stuff and really trying to think about what we can do well that feels new, feels different, hasn't been done well before. Obviously, there's such an incredible cinematic tradition of these comics, but what can we do? And how can we put our own spin on what that is? Well, now that's a pretty interesting lead. Even though it's just a slight mention, we think it's pretty important. Focusing on the Claremont run means we'll get to see all the OG characters, including Cyclops, Jean Grey, Storm, Wolverine, Kitty Pryde, Rogue, Nightcrawler, Colossus, and Magneto, and this is sort of confirmed by the rumors Marvel Studios is indeed looking for actors to play Jean Grey, Cyclops, and Kitty Pryde. Plus, the Claremont era also goes into much darker and more complex territory. Instead of the typical mindless superhero action, it went for the more soap operatic approach, with the storylines being more character-driven and addressing things like persecution, prejudice, female empowerment, and things of that nature. In fact, it covers storylines like the Dark Phoenix Saga, the all-new, all-different era, and so much more. He's also pulling from Grant Morrison's new X-Men, so Schreier was right, it does sound very exciting. The cast rumors. Who's been talked about? Alright, now we're officially into rumor territory, guys. Take everything with a grain of salt, but also, don't forget to get hype. We've been hearing reports that Marvel is eyeing Odessa Azion for Rogue, Peter Claffey for Beast, Harris Dickinson for Cyclops, and Julia Butters for Kitty Pryde. There's also a very prominent rumor that Sadie Sink will be taking on the role of Jean Grey and will be introduced in Spider-Man Brand New Day, which is releasing soon and already has its trailer out. But what's even more interesting is that Feige has hinted that characters like Professor X and Magneto may be reimagined with actors of color. And that would be one hell of a shift from the iconic Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen dynamic. It does feel in line with the whole approach they're going for, where they focus on diversity. Now, casting will probably be handled by Sarah Finn, who's basically been like the MCU's Infinity Gauntlet when it comes to casting, especially with her work on Thunderbolts and Fantastic Four. Production roadmap, where things stand right now. And finally, let's quickly lay down the entire timeline and straighten things out. 1993, we had Marvel selling the rights of the X-Men to Fox. Then, in 2000, first X-Men film was released, and we got like 12 more until 2019, when Disney finally reacquired its IPs from Fox. Then, in 2025, Jake Schreier is confirmed as a director for the reboot. By August of the same year, work had officially begun. Schreier has confirmed this since he and his writers have already begun drafting. But if we're doing real talk, the film is still in very early development. It's still in the scriptwriting phase, and filming dates are far off. In fact, the cast hasn't even been locked down, and we can assume that the film will be a part of Phase 7, which means after Secret Wars, which probably means late 2027. So if you want our guess at the release date, probably sometime in 2028. But don't worry, guys, because this isn't going to be just one movie. We're waiting for a whole franchise reboot. Schreier has more or less confirmed that multiple films are very much on the table. He said, "I think that obviously, first things first, we have to make one great movie. But we always have an eye as we're talking about it too. What are the different places this can go? What are the places that have been in the comics? What hasn't been explored as much, and how can that be incorporated? What are some of the different avenues that we could take to feel like the kind of less trodden path that we could go down?" But those ideas are always out there as we have the discussions. So I'm pretty sure being patient will pay off in this case, and honestly, we have so much coming up with Brand New Day and Doomsday this year, at least 3 projects in 2027, including Secret Wars. The wait's gonna be easy breezy. Of course, we'll be right here with more updates the moment we hear anything at all. So we'll see you soon in the next one. Until then, stay safe out there and have a wonderful day.